Good morning, and thank you for joining the archive, Dr. Brian Regal. How are you doing today?
Good, good. I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on. So my latest book is called "The Battle Over America's Origin Story," and it was supposed to be called "Waiting for Columbus," and "Battle Over America's Origin Story" was supposed to be the subtitle. But the publishers, Palgrave Macmillan, decided they liked the 300 pages of writing I did, which made up the main part of the text. And so I titled the introduction Waiting for Columbus. And I call it that, or wanted to call it that, because this is a book not about who really discovered America. Uh, we know who discovered America, and it wasn't Columbus. The you can't the line I always use is you can't say you discovered a place if when you show up, there's already people there watching you show up. So you can't be the one to discover. You can't be the first one there if there are other people there ahead of you. And so in the long list of people who come to what we call the Americas, the only ones who, when they showed up, there was no one here in front of them, were the ancestors to the Native Americans. So they discovered America. We don't have any specific names of individuals, but it's the ancestors of the Native Americans. They discovered America. They were the first ones here. They were the first ones before anybody else. And so what I wanted to do with this book was to write about all of these myths and legends about who really, with the word really in quotation marks, who really discovered America. Now, if you ask the average person on the street who discovered America, they'll say Christopher Columbus, of course. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, yada, yada, yada. Columbus discovered America. There's a lot of problems with that. First off, Columbus was a real person. It's a very popular thing, it seems, these days for conspiracy theorists, and I don't consider myself one, to take some famous person or persons who did something that we all know about and say, well, that person never really existed. It was someone. Shakespeare didn't write his own work. Somebody else wrote it. And there is actually a sliver of anti-Columbus thinking that says the guy we all think of as Christopher Columbus wasn't really Christopher Columbus. He was another guy, but I didn't really get into that. I mentioned it, but I didn't really get into it because that's a whole other project.
Yeah, but I will actually cut you off quickly to ask you this one question. What I heard that Columbus was an alias name.
Yes.
It was. Okay.
Well, according to this conspiracy theory,
Okay.
that the real guy was a guy named Zarco, who was Portuguese, working for the Portuguese government, who's trying to undermine the Spanish government because they're both fighting to see who gets to control access to Africa and then to India, and it snowballs into this whole long thing. But Christopher Columbus, Cristobal Colon, you can say his name a half a dozen different ways, was a real person. We know that. And he did sail with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. He was bankrolled by the Spanish crown, Ferdinand and Isabella. And he comes across the ocean and he finds what he thinks he's looking for. He's not looking for America. Virtually no one in Europe, really, virtually no one outside of the Americas know that the Americas are there. As far as Europeans are concerned, if you sail west away from Europe, it's just going to be this huge ocean. You're going to come around to the other side of the world, and you're going to wind up in Asia somewhere, China, maybe India. That's where Columbus is going. He's trying to get to India. He's not trying to get to this mythical place that's halfway through, because the Colombian travels, and he goes 4 times. Most people, when they think of Columbus, they think of that one trip. They think of the 1492 trip, but he comes back and he goes back and forth 4 times, and he's not out for adventure. He's not out to broaden the human experience. He's not out to try to bring all the cosmos under one understanding of he's out for the money. This is a business venture. Europeans' interest in the Americas right from day one is always about money. They see the Americas, or what they think is the Americas, what they think is India, they think it as an opportunity to get rich. That's the reason why Columbus goes on this trip. That's the reason why Ferdinand and Isabella bankroll him, because they figure if this guy can find a cheap, easy way to India, we can make a fortune off of this, because other European countries aren't going to be able to do it. And by the time they get around to it, we can have control of it. So he heads west, and he runs into land. He thinks he's in like a series of outer barrier islands off the coast of India. The reality is he's in the Caribbean, what we now call the Caribbean. And he goes back and he says, I made it to India. But that's the basic idea of who discovered America. Christopher Columbus comes along, he finds America, and gets this whole machinery turning, where other Europeans are going to come over and start exploring and start gobbling up land and murdering the native people, and growing sugar and tobacco very quickly degenerates into genocide. But we don't like to talk about that, so there's that. So that actually did happen. Columbus does come over 1492. He thinks he's in India. He goes to his deathbed. He's on his deathbed, and people try to tell him, Admiral, you found this whole new place. And he's like, no, I didn't. I found a way to India. Why do you keep telling me this nonsense? Were you there? No, you weren't there. I was there. I was in India, and he dies.
And so how long was that after he discovered it?
Well, he shows up in 1492. It isn't really, people don't really realize what they've found or what they've come across until about 1500. It's still kind of up in the air about what is this place really, because some other people have come along behind Columbus, and they get there. The first map that famously contains the word America, what's called the Van Simuler map. You have to say it with an outrageous German accent. Van Simuler and his partner Matthias Ringman, they're the ones who are trying to create a new cosmography that is a complete book of the universe. And as they're working on their, Ringman was the author, Von Simuler was the cartographer. He's the one that's making the maps. And they get this bright idea: let's include a map of this new place. Because the term Novus Mundus, New World, that's gotten, the origins of that term are a little dicey. It's usually attributed to Amerigo Vespucci. But we could do this whole show just on how America gets its name. But I don't want to drift away.
Yeah, without drifting too
quickly.
far. But I'm going to ask you quickly, for people watching us who don't know, you said cosmography. Could you quick second to explain what that is?
Well, cosmography is basically just a book that attempts to include everything we know about the universe, writing about the cosmos, cosmography. And they were very popular. We don't really make them anymore. The closest you get to cosmographies today are atlases. The modern atlas, like a book of maps, usually just maps with very little text. They begin as these cosmographies, this attempt to say, you can have in this one book all the knowledge about the universe, all the knowledge about the earth. And so that's what von Mueller and Ringman are trying to do. And a number of them have been made before and since, but they decide to include all this information on this new place. And they include they get information from Columbus, not directly from him because he's dead by the time they start doing this. They throw in information supposedly that comes from Amerigo Vespucci, and Vespucci is a whole other problematic story because he's not really what most people think. But we'll sort of skate over that quickly.
Yeah, so this is like a whole map book, and in it there's also like herbal lore, astronomical lore of the time.
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And so, yes, so they decide to let's make a map of the Earth and include this new land over here west of Europe. They were professional cartographers. That's what they did for a living. And so they draw it, and then they decide, okay, well, we got to name it something. And they come up with the bright idea. We used mostly information we got from Amerigo Vespucci, so let's call it America. So this book appears with this map in it, and for the very first time, this landmass is labeled America. Now, both Ringman and Ringman and von Mueller, some years when they go to do a new edition, they sit down and they say, were we right to call this America? Because and so they changed their minds. And so the second edition, the word America they use Novus Mundus, New World. But by then, the cat's out of the bag. Other map makers have copied this. And so now America, the name America sticks to this place and you're never going to get rid of it. So what I wanted to talk about in this book was who are all these other people that legend, myth, tradition, whatever, says got here before Columbus. One of the things I've always found fascinating about the whole Columbus story is Columbus never actually lands on the mainland of America. He's on the islands in the Caribbean. He never comes to what we now call North America. Doesn't even know it's there, but somehow he gets credit for all of this. But there are these stories, or there are all these legends about these different people who supposedly came here way before Columbus. And that's what I wanted to talk about in this book. And so I talk about things like St. Brendan and Prince Madoc. There are stories about Portuguese fishermen who wind up here first, who don't even know where they are. There's a tradition about Chinese explorers coming to what they called Fusang. That's what supposedly early Chinese explorers called the Americas. There are legends about a Mali Africa king named Abu Bakri, who also gets over here first. We also have the interesting case of the so-called mound builders. The mound builders were these people, they're Native American people, who built basically cities. We have this myth that somehow Native Americans didn't know anything about building, that all they really built were these sort of simple structures with like twigs and skins on top of them. But there were Native American cultures who built genuine cities all along, up and down the Mississippi River Valley, and even out in the Western territories, cities with streets and stone buildings. And when Europeans come across these, they refuse to think that Native Americans did this. The Native Americans, the Indians, who we get from Columbus, because Columbus thinks he's in India. And so he starts referring to the people there as Indians. That's why Native Americans are sometimes called Indians, because it's all Columbus's fault.
Yeah.
And so the Europeans, explorers, they find these stone cities and say, the Native Americans, the Indians are too stupid to have been able to build these. There must have been some great white lost race that came here
And
eons ago
and this goes
and
all
built
the way
these.
back to the very beginning when Europeans were first finding these.
Yes, like right from the start. There's no way the Indians built these. They're too complicated. They're too sophisticated. Two things which the native people are not. And so we got to come up with ideas about who really did all this.
Oh my God. So what are all right, so I'm curious. Like I don't have a historian's mind at all. I'm just a filmmaker. Um, as a historian, like like where'd you go? How'd you find these sources? Like fill me in on that.
Well, what we historians do, we look for paperwork. When historian starts when I start a research project, my first question is, where's the papers? Where are the letters? Where are the notebooks? Where are the written accounts of all of this? That's basically your basic difference between a historian and an archaeologist. Archaeologists look for physical objects. Historians look for the written word. Now, historians also look for physical objects, and archaeologists look for the written word too, but the emphasis is a little different. Archaeologists go for objects, and my many archaeologist friends who are listening to this right now are probably screaming at me. Historians look for texts. And what happens is, when you get a little piece of something and you start following it, and usually what happens is, as you follow some little trail, it branches out and you start finding more things. And you follow this trail and that branches out into 100 trails that way. And you follow this trail and that branches out into 100 trails that way. And so very quickly, all this stuff starts coming out that you can follow. And so that's how it happened. I I started with what is sometimes referred to as the Viking theory. That's usually the kind of entry portal for a lot of people who want to look at this. And that's because there's a lot of material on it, and a lot of material that's easy to find. And you start looking at the Viking theory, and then you start seeing references to these other people. And so then you follow those. And then you look at the mythology. For example, you have Saint Brendan, who's an Irish monk, and you have Prince Madoc, who's a Welsh prince. There are stories about them in their cultures. Brendan was a monk. He travels around so much that he gets known as Brendan the Navigator. He is credited with with discovering the Faroe Islands north of Scotland. He travels around in little tiny boats, finds a bunch of stuff. And so people think, well, here's a guy who has been sailing around. He probably got to America, but there's no evidence he did. Prince Madoc, there's a story about Prince Madoc where he's Welsh. He comes from an important Welsh family. These stories always have a hero. There's always that one guy, never a woman. It's always a guy, usually from like a royal family, who, for whatever reason, decides to, hightail it out of there. And the legend says that Madoc, who we think was a real person, came from this wealthy, important Welsh royal family, but he had a couple of brothers ahead of him, and so he's not going to inherit the kingdom when his dad dies. So he decides to go off on his own, and he takes a boat and he takes some friends. A lot of these stories sound like a bunch of drunken frat guys who get in the car on a weekend with like half a dozen, cases of beer in the trunk, and they just head off to see what they can find. And so that's what Madoc does. He heads off and he finds a place. It's never really identified where he gets to, if he gets to anywhere. Same thing with Brendan. He heads off west, gets to, somewhere. And it's usually later researchers, later writers who come across this material and say, wait a minute, Madoc got in a boat with a bunch of his friends and they head west out over the Great Western Sea and they find a mysterious place. Well, what do you find west of the British Isles? That seems like a mysterious. They must have gone to America. Madoc discovered America. Now, this will come back much later, after North America starts to get colonized by Europeans. You get a lot of people, not exclusively, but you get a lot of people from the British Isles, a lot of English explorers, Irish explorers, Welsh explorers, Scots explorers coming here. They start setting up, communities, and they're the ones who kind of start setting up what will eventually become the 13 colonies. And so there's a lot of Welsh people who have migrated from Wales to what is now being referred to as British North America. Because the British government now decides, well, there's English people over there. We own it. It's ours now. And what's interesting is one of the people involved in, see, this whole story, the minute you find one fascinating character and you think, okay, here's this really fascinating character, you realize there's 10 more fascinating characters lined up behind them, involved in all this. And so when the British, part of the reason why the British decide that North America belongs to them now is because this was during the period of Elizabeth I, the Queen of England, Ginger Liz, as they called her, because she had red hair. And this is during Shakespeare is alive, and she has a counsel, one of many, who is John Dee, who is already a famous philosopher, thinker, alchemist, occultist. He tells Queen Elizabeth that you need to tell everyone that this new world here belongs to you, Elizabeth. You're going to make it, it'll help create a British Empire. It's thought that John Dee is the first person to use the expression British Empire. And so the British decide, well, this all belongs to us now. And so that's why you get a bunch of people from the British Isles. Again, not exclusively. There are people coming from other places, but a lot of them are coming from the British Isles during this period. And so you get the city of Baltimore has been founded, and you get a lot of Welsh people congregating in Baltimore. Now, at the same time, there is this kind of revival of Welsh nationalism. And a lot of people want to, we're the Welsh, hooray for the Welsh. And there's this young guy back in Wales named John Thomas Evans. He wants to be a poet. He wants to be an explorer. He loves being Welsh. He wants to promote Welshness. He decides, because there is a tradition, because none of these stories have one version. They all have like a dozen versions to them. And one of the Madoc versions is that Madoc gets to North America, and he and his merry band of Welsh pranksters head inland. And they encounter a number of Native American groups. And before anybody knows it, the Welsh are interbreeding with the Native Americans. And so, as the story goes, this whole new population of half European, half Welsh, half Native Americans is now running around North America. And because the native people have bred with the Welsh, supposedly, you get these groups of native people who have very light skin, blue eyes, blonde, even red hair. And so this becomes a thing that people think is real. The so-called Welsh Indians, sometimes called white Indians. A lot of people get interested in this. And one of them is this guy, John Thomas Evans. He's like in his mid-20s at the time. And he decides he's going to go and prove, number one, that Madoc discovered America, and two, that Welsh Indians / white Indians is a real thing. And so he gets on a boat, comes over, winds up in Baltimore. Now, this whole story about who discovered America is filled with tragic characters. That's one of the reasons why I was kind of attracted to it. I'm attracted to tragic characters. You know, people who try to find something, even though everyone is telling them it's not there, you're not going to be good enough. John Thomas Evans has no experience at anything. He's not an explorer. He can't read a map. He knows nothing about conditions here in America, but he is so determined, he just gets on a boat and comes over and figures, well, I'll figure something out when I get there. So he gets into Baltimore and he gets hooked up with the Welsh community there, and he tells them what he's trying to do. And they're all like, dude, don't do this. This is a suicide mission. You know, first off, we've never seen any Welsh Indians. And secondly, you don't know anything about the interior. Indians aren't one people. There are a lot of different ethnic groups who all speak different languages. You don't know any of those languages. You stay with us, settle here with us in the Welsh community, and we'll all live happily ever after. No, I don't want. He gets to the Mississippi River, and he hooks up with some sort of shady characters, and he gets on a boat, and they travel north up the Mississippi River. He's in the middle of nowhere. You know, he's this pudgy 20-something white guy from Wales, stumbling around, trying to prove that white Indians exist. And he has a number of adventures, and he finally encounters the Mandan people. And the Mandan live in Nebraska, the Dakotas, and they're a group that their name will often come up when speaking about these European Native Americans, you know, people, Europeans who mated with Native Americans and created this sort of new group of people. And he meets the Mandan, and they're really nice. They're one of the few groups that treat him nicely. You know, they don't beat him up. They don't try to kill him. They kind of welcome him in. I'm sure the reason they didn't, you know, they treated him sort of nice. It was like they were thinking, who's this insane white guy? You know, we see hardly any white guys out here, and finally one comes along, and he's a nut job. And you know, he's looking for something that's not there. And so I think what happened is they sort of pat him on the head and say, "Oh yeah, we've heard about. We have people around here who look like you. Meanwhile, there's nobody out there that looks like him." And it starts to dawn on him that this whole white Indian Madoc story is nonsense. It never happened. It's just a myth. He's kind of heartbroken because he's come halfway around the world to try to prove this thing, and then when he gets there, there's no Santa Claus, you know. And so, you know, he's really bummed out. He heads back down the Mississippi. He winds up in St. Louis, where he sort of becomes an alcoholic. And then he, you know, all he wants to do is go back to Wales, but he never does because he catches malaria, and he dies in a rundown, disgusting hovel somewhere on some back street in St. Louis. And so I always see him as, like, of all these tragic characters, he's the most tragic, in part because he's one of these people who try to prove this thing, and reaches a point where he says, you know, I was wrong. Everything I thought about this, everything I thought about Madoc was wrong. And very few of these, I call them the outsider thinkers, outsider writers. Very few of them ever reach that kind of emotional, intellectual point, which is tough, you know, for anybody. When you believe in something all your life, you know, and suddenly you get hit in the face with evidence that this thing you thought you believed and you thought was real, that you may have based your whole life upon, you suddenly realize it's not there. It's false. You were wrong the whole time. And people don't deal with that kind of thing, you know. It's like finding out when you're in your 40s that your parents weren't your real parents, you know, that you were adopted or something. And so he never proves that there were white Indians, never proves that there were Welsh Indians. And to this day, you'll still find people who will bring, oh, well, there are Indians out in the West who look like white people. That's because Madoc, and you know. So there's that legend gone. There's a bunch of others we could spend the entire time just on one of these. You know, the China, the Asia theory is fascinating because there are Chinese texts. There's this very famous Chinese manuscript called the Classics of Mountain and Sea, which is kind of a Chinese version of a cosmology, trying to tell the whole story of the world. And in that and a few other texts, it mentions something called Fusang. We spell it in the Latin alphabet, Fusang. And there are some maps that were discovered in the 20th century, maps drawn in China, maps drawn in Korea, that show sort of the world, sort of world maps, sort of crudely drawn. But there are these sort of land masses that are labeled Fusang, kind of west of the eastern coast of China. And some people think that that means America. And in these sort of crudely drawn maps, Fusang is America. There are a couple of explorers' names, Zheng He, Wei Shen, who are in the tradition that they somehow make it to Fusang. Zheng He was a real person. He was an admiral in the Chinese Navy, very close to the emperor, who did do a lot of exploring with navies of many large ships. We know they traveled down into Malaysia and towards like Singapore and Burma and those places. And so people think, well, if he did that, he must have gone to America too. But there's no evidence of that. Wei Shen actually comes along about 1,000 years before Zheng He. His story is he's a monk. And again, it's the bunch of frat boys in a car on the weekend. Wei Shen gets a bunch of his monk friends. They get in a boat and they head east out across the ocean. And he supposedly gets to America, which he may also have called Fusang, but we're not really sure. And he gets to around the year 500, he gets to what we now know as Mexico. And Wei Shen encounters the native people of Mexico and realizes they're not very smart. They don't know how to do anything. He teaches them. Wei Shen teaches the people of ancient Mexico, the Mesoamericans. We don't call them pre-Columbians anymore. He teaches them farming. He teaches them the arts. He teaches them metallurgy. So this one guy creates the Aztecs and the Incas and the Maya and the Olmecs and basically every major Central American culture is a result, excuse me, of this one Chinese guy and a couple of his friends showing up and teaching them how to be civilized. You see that that's another one of those threads which we could spend the whole time talking about in the whole who discovered America question. There's a lot of racial baggage. There's a lot of supremacist baggage. There's a lot of anger and hateful baggage in this. Some legends less, some legends more, but there is this sort of universal belief by all these groups and all these legends that the native people are basically too stupid to have done anything on their own. They needed these outsiders to come along and teach them how to do this stuff. Now, as you can imagine, this sort of thing drives Native American historians crazy. There's a group of Central American historians, very good historians, very good archaeologists, who have spent large chunks of their careers trying to explain that this is all racial garbage.
So what are like some of the, like, people claim like, okay, there's a text that's proof. Some people in, I think, California have looked for circular shaped rocks.
Right. The anchors, the ship anchors. They're not fake, but they're not ship anchors. See, one of the issues that always makes me crazy about, mystery hunters. When I hear the term mystery hunter, I start to grind my teeth. People who search out mysteries, and mysteries are fascinating. I'm not saying, I got into this field from sitting when I was, 7, 8 years old, sitting on the living room floor watching Leonard Nimoy on In Search Of. So that's how I got into this. So I understand the draw and the romanticism of mystery hunting. The problem is most people who do this mystery hunting, they don't get any expertise in anything. If you want to study, for example, if you want to say, okay, Leif Erikson, we know Leif Erikson came to America before Columbus because of the Vinland sagas. Can you read the Vinland sagas? Can you read them in their original language? Well, no, not really. I do the translation. Well, then you're not really reading the Vinland sagas. If you are studying some Native American group, if you can't read their language, you're not getting the full story. Excuse me. If you can't read ancient Egyptian, how are you going to tell me you know who really built the pyramids? And one of the things that always made me crazy about this is in those supposed stone anchors. They were found off the coast of California. They find them every once in a while. They're about the size of a Frisbee, and they're stone, and they have a hole seemingly drilled through the middle. And when they were first discovered, people thought, oh, in ancient times in Japan and China, sailors would take these stones and carve them into sort of like a donut, like a stone donut. And the hole in the middle, so you put the rope through, and they would use these as an anchor. You get to where you're going, you don't want to be floating around, you throw this stone donut anchor over the side, and that holds you in place like any anchor does. And so it was the belief that, well, this must be proof, physical proof, that Japanese or Chinese sailors had come to Southern California way before Columbus. And the anchors they were using, some of them broke, you lose them, the rope gets frayed, and the thing falls down to the bottom of the water there. This must be proof that these sailors came here with their Chinese, Japanese boats, and these were their anchors, which on the surface seems logical enough. The problem is they're not stone anchors because geologists, real geologists, looked at these things and they said, these are not anchors. These are naturally occurring stone concretions. You find them all up and down the California coast. Because of the vagaries of where the ocean currents go, you wouldn't think this was possible, but the oceans can actually carve these things over long periods of time. And then they settle to the bottom, and mystery hunters come along and say, oh, I found a Chinese anchor. They're not actually anchors. They're naturally occurring stone formations.
Yeah.
And so you have that problem. Yeah.
So the real anchors, so you said the naturally occurring ones are like frisbee size.
Yeah.
Would they have made bigger ones or?
Yeah, it all depends upon the size of the ship. If you're in the U.S. Navy, for example, they don't put the same size anchor on a coastal gunboat that they put on an aircraft carrier. Because the aircraft carrier is a much bigger object, and so you need a much bigger anchor with huge, thick chains that you wouldn't put on a smaller boat. And so these guys likely did the same thing. If you have a big boat, you want a big anchor. Got a little boat, you got a little anchor. And so there's just yet another example of how people who are sincere in trying to figure this stuff out don't have the background knowledge to understand what they're looking at. One of my favorite parts of this book is, I call them the inscription hunters. There's a long tradition of people finding inscribed stones. It started in New England with so-called rune stones, and then as you work your way out west, you find similar things out there. These are supposedly stones that early people, pre-Columbian people, carved messages into. The two most famous are probably Dighton Rock, which originally was in Rhode Island. I think it's since been taken out of the ground and moved to a secure, like little museum building. And then, of course, there's the Kensington Stone, which a lot of people know this. It's a sort of a tombstone-shaped slab of rock with supposedly runic words carved into them. The Kensington Stone is fake. It's a modern fake. The Dighton Rock is a little different. The Dighton Rock really isn't a true fake. It's carvings that were done probably by Native Americans. And so in that case, in that way, it's not fake. But people think, because they can't read the written language of the Narragansett people. The Narragansetts are the ones who lived in that region. The Bay of Rhode Island is still called Narragansett Bay after these people. And so it became a really popular in inscribed stone to look at and say, here's proof that the Portuguese came here way before. But it's likely the carvings are all done by relatively modern Native Americans, not Europeans coming over before Columbus. But you see a lot of this stuff. As you head out west, you see more of it. And there was this little sort of gaggle of amateur investigators, the inscription hunters, as I call them, who in the 1940s, 50s, 60s poking around out west in Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, would come across these stones that seemed to have writing carved into them. Now, not once did any of these investigators ever think, oh, these must have been done by the native people. They had a written language. No, native people didn't do it. They're not smart enough to do it. It looks sort of like, because I'm not a linguist and I don't know anything about Native American languages, and I don't know anything about European languages, and I don't know anything about the languages of the classical world. I can't read Latin or Greek or Hebrew, but I'm going to decide that these carved letters look like ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek. There's the Las Lunas Decalogue, for example, which is one of the more famous ones that people believe has Greek writing on it. The one in Oklahoma supposedly got Hebrew writing on it. But obviously, well, if that's so, then that means ancient Hebrews got to Oklahoma somehow, and ancient Greeks and Romans and Carthaginians. One of the fascinating things about this whole story is that you basically can't spit without hitting an ancient culture that someone doesn't claim got to America before everybody else. The most obscure ancient civilizations, there are people out there who say there's evidence they came here first. So, in Oklahoma, you got ancient Hebrews, you got ancient Greeks and Romans, Carthaginians, all running around carving stuff. But all these carvings, they're not from the Native Americans. They're from these outside groups. And this woman, Gloria Farley, who had no training in anything. That's another constant you see amongst the outsider authors. They have no training. They're not trained as historians. They're not trained as archaeologists. They're not trained as geographers. They're not trained as linguists. They're just enthusiastic people who go out and think, I'm smarter than all those historians, not because of my extensive education, but because I don't have an extensive education. The reason you shouldn't trust historians and linguists and archaeologists and anthropologists is because they're trained in their job. So the more educated you are, this thinking goes, the less you can be treated, because the dumber you are. Now, if that sounds insane, it's because it is.
Perfectly logical thinking right there.
There's no comeback for that. Even to this day, I mean, I get yelled at on, excuse me, I get yelled at on social media all the time. And the biggest insult that people think they're giving me is, you don't know about this because of your fancy PhD. That means you don't know what you're talking about. I know what I'm talking about. I've been out there in the field. You haven't been out there in the field. Actually, I have been out there in the field, but I've been out in the field. I've looked at the stuff. I've held the stuff. You don't know what you're talking about. You shouldn't be believed. I had a guy tell me once, I used to write a lot of op-ed pieces about controversial topics. I haven't done any because of COVID and other reasons. But I used to write 3-4 op-ed pieces a year, usually on controversial topics. My feeling is, if you're not going to write about something controversial, why bother? And, I've written about abortion, and I've written about gun laws, and I've written about immigration, and I always get tons of hate mail because of it. And once I was asked to do a op-ed for Columbus Day, and I was just starting this book. And I thought, sweet, I can do, I'll do that, sure. So I write this, 750 word op-ed piece in which I never once disparaged Columbus. I could have called him an opportunist. I could have called him a slaver, all these things he was, but I didn't. I just, the point of the op-ed was to say there are all these other legends about Leif Erikson and Fusang and, not just the Columbus story. And I got a bunch of hate mail over it. And my favorite was this guy who was a member of a local Italian American society wrote to me this 2-page type letter, like on a letterhead. Society, they had letterhead. The society had a letterhead. And he sends me this 2-page thing, basically telling me I'm an idiot. I don't know what I'm talking about. How dare I say this? And he ends his letter by saying, my op-ed shows 2 things. I don't know what I'm talking about, and I hate Italians. And I said to the guy, dude, how can I hate Italians? I love ziti. I love pizza. How can I hate Italians? Come on. What are you talking about? And the other one, my other favorite, was this guy wrote to me and he said at the end of this long hate letter, he says, what you wrote, I don't even remember what it was I was writing about. He says, your op-ed just goes to prove that you're one of these run-of-the-mill socialist professors. And I wrote, initially I wasn't going to write back, but I said, oh, okay, I'll write back to this guy. And, oh no, he said, typical. You're just one of these typical socialist historians. And I wrote back and I said, sir, you're wrong. I'm not a typical socialist historian. I'm an outstanding socialist historian. And so I didn't get anything back from him. But we're at the 1 hour mark. So why don't I finish up with probably the legend or the myth that most people are at least vaguely familiar with. I'll talk about the Viking theory. And in order to understand the Viking theory of discovery, you have to understand there's 2 versions of the story. There's the story that's based in reality, and then there's the story that's based in mythology. The mythological story comes first. And it's only later, in the 1960s, an archaeological site was discovered in Newfoundland at a place called Lanso Meadow that was definitively proven, and there's still a dig going on there, was definitively proven to be a site, a community that was built by sort of Scandinavian explorers / farmers. The artifacts have been found there. It's really beyond question that this was a site 500 years before Columbus where Nordic people, Scandinavian people, had come to North America. So we know that even amongst Europeans, Columbus wasn't the first one here. These Nordic, until we find other evidence, these Nordic people, they were the first ones here. So that's the reality of the Viking discovery myth. And I mean, even the term Viking is hugely problematic because it doesn't really start getting used until the 19th century. It comes into wider use because of the German playwright Richard Wagner. He's the guy who, like, you're sitting here right now, people are sitting here right now listening to this. When you hear the term Viking, an image pops into your head. That is the image that Richard Wagner created. The helmet with the horns, the fur and all. That's a 19th century construction. There were Norse pirates who made a living and rampaging and killing their way across Europe. They even got down into the Middle East and may have brought Islam with them back to Scandinavia. But that's the reality. The myth version, the fantasy version, involves Leif Erikson. And this whole story comes out of a medieval text, an Icelandic medieval text, known as the Vinland Sagas. and it's part of a much larger. The original is in Copenhagen, in the University of Copenhagen Library. This huge, thick medieval manuscript, handwritten, hand illustrated, and one small, tiny chapter of it tells the story about a guy named Eric the Red and his wacky family. Eric is from Iceland. He kills a guy who kills one of his slaves. People don't realize that, this Viking culture was a slave culture. He's forced to leave Iceland. He goes to the next big landmass north, and he settles, and he tries to turn it into a kind of real estate deal. You know how people will buy a tract of land, and then they'll start building mansions on it, and then they try to attract people to move there. That's what Eric the Red does in what he now calls Greenland. Because if he called it what it actually was, which is a land of freezing cold weather, ice and snow, no one's going to want to go there. So he calls it Greenland. And he brings his family with him, and they establish a sort of a plantation. And his son's name is Leif, and his daughter is Freydis. And they start building this community. One of Leif's friends, a guy named Barney Herlufsen, he now wants to come over and live there too. So he gets a couple of Viking longboats together, and they full of stuff and friends. Again, imagine the carload of frat boys on the weekend with a trunk full of beer. They're going off to have fun.
That'd be
So they're heading to
by frat boy weekend parties.
Yeah, the reality of history always blows people's minds. We think this is something we just invented. That the young guys never did this before. So Barney and his pals, they take the sea, and they're going to go to Greenland and join up with Leif and his dad, and they're going to get land because it's all free. They get lost, and they sort of drift west of where they're going. And as they're doing that, Barney sees in the distance, he can just see in the distance, a large landmass to the west. They don't actually go there, but they see it. Then they kind of figure out where they are, and they manage to, get back to where Eric and everybody else is, and they land safely, and everybody's happy. And Barney tells Leif, I saw land. Did you know about this? There's land west of here. Not that far. And so Leif decides, for some reason, Barney doesn't go with them. But I love the idea that if this story is true, because there's no outside confirmation, it's all from this text, it's all from the Vinland sagas. If it's real, the first European to see America is a guy named Barney. I just find that hilarious. I'm not sure why. I just find it hilarious that the first European to see America is a guy named Barney. They head west, and they get to this land because it's really not as for the way these Norse sailors travel. It's not that far, and it turns into a whole Goldilocks kind of thing. The first place they get to, it's awful. It's cold. It's not very inviting. They head south, find another place. That's a little bit better, but it's really rocky. And then, again, they don't really care for it. They head south again, and then they find a really nice place with trees and grass, and the weather's kind of pleasant, and they land there. And because, again, according to this story, this third place is sort of lush and green, and there are vines growing with grapes on them that everybody immediately starts eating and getting drunk off of. Leif calls it Vinland, the land of vines. And so that's where the name comes from. And so there's this whole story that, this legend starts to grow. that Leif creates a settlement and everything's hunky-dory. They have run-ins with the native people who at some point, either while they're there or later when the stories start getting written down, because remember, all these stories, as all medieval manuscripts do, start off as oral tales or oral histories. And then eventually much later, somebody starts writing them down. So we don't know whether this word comes out when these Norse people are there, or whether somebody calls the native people this later in the written text, but the native people start being called Skraelings. And there are some cases where the Skraelings and the Norse kind of get along. Some examples where they don't. There's one famous story where the Vikings, who supposedly have this reputation as these tough guys, macho alpha males, decide to raid a native village, and they're charging up the hill, waving their swords around, and suddenly the natives roll out a catapult that they've built, and they start firing rocks at the Vikings. And the Vikings get, this freaks them out. They run away, So much for that Viking macho image. And there's one example where Leif's sister, Freydis, she's a real piece of work. Freydis is the first, and once again, I keep having to do this caveat: if the Vinland sagas are accurate, if they're not just made up stories like a lot of scholars think they are, she is the first European woman mentioned anywhere in a text about North America. Excuse me. When the Vikings run away from the native people, she gets angry at the Vikings. You're supposed to be Viking men. What are you doing running away from these Skraelings? She takes off all of her clothes. She picks up a sword and she charges the Native Americans, screaming and waving the sword around. And the native people are like, who's this insane white woman? She must be like a sorceress or something. Let's get the hell out of here. So they leave, and she wins the day. She wins the field. The other great story, it tells you, I think, all you need to know about Freydis. She wanted to take over. She wanted to take over Greenland and take over Vinland from her brother and the other men, sort of become queen of Vinland. But her husband is kind of a milquetoasty guy. He's not really tough, and she treats him badly. There was a little faction of men who realized what she was doing, and they're sort of become like the opposition. Freydis is kind of trying to take over. She's trying to steal from us, and she convinces some of her male followers, the people that she doesn't like. They all live in one house. She convinces these guys to break into the house and murder everybody inside. So they go in and they kill all the men, and then they come out. And Freydis is like, well, what about the women? And like, well, they're women. We didn't kill them. We killed the men. She gets mad. She grabs an axe. She charges in there and she hacks to death all the women inside there because she wants everybody dead. That's who this person is. So time goes by and the Vinland sagas get written. By then, Norse people have left North America, gone back to Greenland. They eventually even leave Greenland and go back to Iceland or Norway or Sweden. And so the Norse presence in North America is now gone. The Vinland sagas are written. It's a single manuscript. And scholars start coming across this Vinland Saga manuscript. And they start putting two and two together, and they say, wait a minute. Vinland, if we sort of look at maps, and read the descriptions in the text, Vinland's got to be North America. And so the Vikings discovered North America. And it really kind of hits a chord. And you get a bunch of people here in the United States. This is by the 19th century. A bunch of people, early 19th century, a guy named Carl Christian Raffin publishes a translation of the Vinland Sagas with a bunch of maps and things in it. He includes a drawing of Dighton Rock because he thinks that's important. He puts an English language introduction into this. It's called the Civitates Americanae. And this kind of spreads the word of this. And slowly but surely, you start to get people believing that the Norse are the ones who get here first before Columbus. But they need sort of a real good cheerleader. Enter Eben Norton Horsford, one of the great names in America. Nobody names their kids Eben Norton anymore. Eben Norton Horsford. He's a chemist at Harvard. And well-respected chemist. He's the guy who invents baking powder. He invents condensed milk. He's wealthy. He marries into a wealthy Boston. He marries into a wealthy Boston Brahmin family. So he's got tons of money. He starts promoting this. He gets fixated. He gets hooked on it. He starts promoting the idea that Leif Erikson discovered America. He starts searching maps and old books. And he decides, at the time, one of the more common thoughts about if Leif Erikson where's Vinland? If Vinland's North America, where specifically is it? And a lot of people thought that Vinland was the Penobscot River in Maine. Horsford doesn't believe that. He says, no, it's not the Penobscot River in Maine. It's the Charles River at Boston, which luckily is right where he lives. So it's sort of serendipitous that it kind of works out nicely that way, that he figures out that Leif Erikson's house was basically up the street from his own house. As he does some exploring, he finds some rocks in the ground, and he begins writing these sort of lavishly illustrated books with fold-out maps and drawings, proving that Leif Erikson's house is on the Charles River, outside of Boston, along with this lost city. We don't have many lost cities in North American history, like El Dorado or, Xanadu or something like that. But there is the one lost city legend in North American history is Norumbega. And Norumbega was supposed to be this very Xanadu-like walled city, a very wealthy culture with jewels and high education and all that stuff you always seem to find in a lost city. And Horsford becomes convinced that Norumbega was right outside of where Leif Erikson lived. And he goes poking around, he does a little excavating, and he finds some stones and things. And he becomes convinced that A, Leif Erikson discovered America at Boston, and B, Norumbega was a real place, which is also just outside of Boston. And he's publishing these books, and he gets kind of popular. Historians and archaeologists do not accept this at all. They basically make fun of him. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know. You might be a great chemist, but you don't know anything about history. You don't know anything about archaeology. You don't know anything about linguistics. Norumbega didn't exist. It's not on the Charles River outside Boston. Leif Erikson didn't build a house outside Boston. Uh, and so, there we are. So the one thing that Horsford does, because he's wealthy, he pays to have a memorial put up on the site that he thinks is where Norumbega is. So he has this tower. There's a park there still. To this day, there's still a park there called Norumbega Park. And Horsford has this like 1.5 story tall. It looks like the castle from a chess set. It looks much more medieval than it does ancient Scandinavian, but he's being enthusiastic. So he has this tower built, Norumbega Tower, which again is there to this day. If you live in the region, you can go there. And so there's if you're walking around out by the Charles River and you see this giant chess piece sticking up out of the ground, you found Norumbega Tower. And he gets older and nobody believes him. Despite all these books, besides this thing he built, he's the one who sort of spearheads the construction of the Leif Erikson Memorial that's in Boston still. He was a real conservative guy, even Norton Horsford, but at the same time, he showed that kind of dichotomy that you don't really find much in people anymore, where he was able to kind of combine being a conservative on one hand and a liberal on the other, in this really sort of interesting juxtaposition. And for all his conservative points of view, he was an early champion of women's education. When he decided to have this sculpture of Leif Erikson put up, he gets this woman sculptor who was very famous at the time to actually sculpt the statue of Leif Erikson. And since you said you've been there, you'll notice that Leif doesn't exactly give off, the statue doesn't exactly give off that kind of hyper masculine, traditional Viking look, with the bulging muscles and the fur. He's much more athletic and thin. He's not wearing the helmet with the horns,
Sandals.
He's got a bitch instead of sandals on. And the rumor always was that the woman who sculpted the statue, she was a lesbian, and that she used her girlfriend, her longtime girlfriend, as the model for Leif Erikson. So it has an almost feminine look to it. So like when that was unveiled, people were like, "Oh, that's a Viking." Okay, if you say so, boss. But the Horsford dies in 1893. So he marries into great wealth, the Gardner family. He marries into the Gardner family. That's the name of the art museum, the Gardner Museum. He marries the daughter of the Gardner family. They have a nice life together. They produce a couple of kids. Then the wife dies. And so, as one does, he marries the sister of his dead wife. So he marries one sister, produces a family, she dies, he immediately marries the next sister. They have one child, Cornelia, known to all and sundry as Nellie Horsford. And she's important to the story because she's the only one in the family who doesn't think their dad is wacky, with this Leif Erikson stuff. She buys into it. She jumps right down into that rabbit hole. And as Eben Norton Horsford is lying in his deathbed, literally his deathbed in the house. The whole they know he's dying. The family is there, and he can barely speak, and his wife is holding his hand, and he's trying to say something to his wife, and his wife says, what are you trying to say? And he manages to croak out, "Where's Nellie? I want Nellie." So Nellie comes in, she pushes through the crowd, and she sits on the bed, and she's holding his other hand, and he says, "There's something I want you. You got to promise you'll do this for me." And she's thinking like, "Oh, he wants me to, raise a good family." And he says, "No, I don't care about any of that stuff. I want you to prove I was right, that Leif Erikson did discover America." And he dies. I mean, you could not write a better scene for a movie. And so she becomes fixated on proving her father right. She was like his princess, his daughter's youngest. They were really close. She never gets married. She keeps a photograph of her father with her the entire rest of her life, but she gets involved in she calls in scientists, she calls in architects, she calls in engineers and surveyors to look at these sites to prove that her dad was right, that this is where Norumbega was, and this is where Leif Erikson built his house. And of course, she doesn't do it. She can't, she tries, but she can't do it because Norumbega was not there. There was no Norumbega. Leif Erikson didn't build a house on the Charles River. She's chasing ghosts because she promised her beloved dad on his deathbed that she would do this. And so, she spends the rest of her life. She's a really interesting character. She's got a bunch of nieces and nephews. And because she's got tons of money, she's like a world traveler. She's really sophisticated. She looks great in a tight outfit, She's got guys lined up around the block who want to, marry her. She's not interested in any of them. But she kind of settles into this life as like the coolest aunt you ever had. She's always giving the nieces and nephews money. "Don't tell your father I gave you this money," go traveling around the world. But she never does prove any of this stuff. And she goes to her deathbed not having proved anything. And with her passing, the whole Vikings discovered America legend kind of dies out, only to get resurrected at the end of the 20th century by white supremacists and neo-Nazis, and it sort of runs off the rails from there. But that's just sort of a excuse me, an introduction.
Wait, so they were so the Nazi regime was using her work?
No, the idea,
The idea.
the myth that Vikings discovered America. The Nazis were very enamored of it. There was even a fighting division in the German army called the Viking Division. And then after World War II, you get the spread of neo-Nazism. And in the late 20th century, early 21st century, neo-Nazi groups in Europe and England and America and Canada, they start embracing this whole Vikings discovered America. There are prison gangs called, the Vinland gangs, and and so the white supremacist aspect of this, which was there but not that strong in the Horsford days, now just comes out fully blown. Hatred of immigrants, all that sort of stuff.
So drifting away from the more modern or the more extremist interests, getting into quickly, so there is an actual settlement that's been found in America, but
in Newfoundland,
and
right, which technically is part of Canada.
So it wasn't even America, it was Canada, the Queen country. Um,
Yeah, it's
so
a place called Lanso Meadow.
Lanso Meadow.
Right.
All right.
It's on the Nova Scotia coast. I'm
Okay.
sorry, Newfoundland coast.
Newfoundland coast.
Yeah.
So in Newfoundland, um, so do we know who, like, we know that there was a settlement, but do we know who was there? Do we know what time period?
Yeah, well, we know that they were there. Excuse me. We know they were there uh in the late 1000s, early 1100s, maybe as late as 1200, which ironically is around the time that the Vinland Saga says the whole Leif Erikson thing happened. The problem with the Lanso Meadow excavations is, while there's no doubt that these were Norse people, they don't know any individuals. There's no names like, Olaf was here, carved into a stone or anything. So
Mhm.
we know that there were Norse people there. We don't know any individual Norse people.
Okay.
Now, they may find that at some point in the future, but at the moment, no.
At the moment, no. Okay. And so then another question on the Vinland Saga, we were talking about this before. Um, it's written in three different languages, the
Yeah,
text.
it's in partly in Latin, partly in um, Norwegian, and I think partly in Danish.
All right. So three languages
Well, this
and
the right
story.
this copy was written by monks, and monks were basically the only educated people around at the time, and it was common to write books. That's why you see so many books from the medieval period, even the Renaissance, even like right up through the 1700s, that are written by Europeans, French, English, Italians, Germans, Dutch, Danes, written in Latin, because Latin becomes, with the fall of the Roman Empire, Latin becomes kind of the language of the educated classes. It's the language of scholarship, the language of science, the language of literature. And then only later do the local vernacular languages start being used in text. There was a time in England, for example, that if you wrote a Bible in English, you could get the death penalty. And so it was not unusual to find these texts, excuse me, depending upon the particular monk that was doing the actual physical writing, would write these in different languages.
Interesting. All right, Brian. Well, I think that makes a great conclusion on
That is just a little scratch on the surface of this whole story.
I know.
But
Soon I'll be able to do a whole series on it.
yeah,
All right. Well, thank you again, Brian, for taking the time and talking about all of this. There's great stuff.
my pleasure. It's always fun to talk about wacky things.
Wacky things in history.
It's my job.
Yeah, awesome. Well, keep it up. Thank you again, Brian.
Okay.